esteemed guests, I would like to warmly welcome you also on behalf of the consequences to today's event. If there's one thing the international community can agree on, even in today's difficult circumstances, it is their condemnation of the use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. And there also seems to be broad agreement that the abhorrent crime of using chemical weapons must not remain unpunished. This means that those alleged to have deployed chemical weapons first need to be identified and then brought to justice, be they state or non-state actors. The Chemical Weapons Convention entered into force in 1997. However, even after the total ban on chemical weapons use came into effect, chemical weapons were used several times, most notably in the Syrian Arab Republic. Syria became a state party to the convention in 2013, but this did not stop Syria from continuing to use chemical weapons. Since 2013, UN and OPCW mechanisms have attributed responsibility for chemical weapons use to the Syrian Arab Republic in 9 instances. The last of these reports, published by the OPCW in January, concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that on 7 April 2018, at least one helicopter of the Syrian Arab Air Force dropped 2 cylinders on residential buildings in the Syrian town of Douma, releasing chlorine and killing 43 named individuals and affecting dozens more. Another OPCW report is expected in the near future on chemical weapons used in the Syrian town of Naya in 2015. According to preliminary information, this use might be attributed to Daesh. So when it comes to identifying those responsible for the use of chemical weapons, i.e. attributing responsibility, I think it is fair to say that the international community has been relatively successful. The OPCW has played and continues to play an important role in this respect, by establishing the facts surrounding alleged chemical weapons use, collecting evidence, and identifying those responsible. And by then making its findings available to the IIIM, the wider international community. However, when it comes to bringing the individual perpetrators to justice, the situation is as bleak as it is frustrating. I'm not aware of one instance where the perpetrator of chemical weapons use has been indicted, let alone convicted, either by an international court, by a national court, or a tribunal. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it is evident that there are no easy options for holding the perpetrators for chemical weapons use accountable. However, this should not prevent us from keeping the issue of accountability in the fight against impunity high on our agenda. On the contrary, we should read on our efforts, share experiences, and further explore the existing options as well as new ideas. We owe this to the victims of these horrible crimes. And let me emphasize that ensuring accountability would scare off potential perpetrators of chemical weapons use. This is why bringing those responsible to justice is so important in our efforts to prevent the re-emergence of this horrific weapons. With this in mind, let me wish you a fruitful discussion. And I would like to thank the distinguished panelists for being here today, and Professor Stahl for chairing, and his team, as well as the University of Leiden for hosting this event. And I would like to thank you all for your interest. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Scheeb, Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and friends, it's really an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to this special seminar on behalf of the Goethe Center for International Legal Studies on accountability for the use of chemical weapons. Thanks for joining on such a sunny day. It takes quite some effort, I think, to be here. And we're really excited to have such a wonderful panel with some of the world-leading experts on these issues. First of all, thanks to Ambassador Sheep and the Embassy of Germany for taking the initiative for this meeting. And we're delighted that the event is supported by the embassies of Costa Rica, Cyprus, Japan, Mexico, Poland, as well as the presidency of the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons, and of course the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. So this is a little bit of follow-up of a seminar that we had in March with the OPCW Director Arias, the permanent representation of the US to the OPCW, and US Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Beth von Schaar. But I think the timing could not be more perfect to follow up on a dialogue after the OPCW review conference, and also to look at future avenues how to move ahead. We're really, I think, at a tipping point in relation to the chemical weapons taboo. Sadly, a lot of evidence is there, maybe more evidence than we ever had in the past. UNITAD alone digitized several millions of documents. They're all available. But the crucial question is, how do we move ahead? Obviously, for a long time, Syria has been in the limelight, and the OPCW has been pioneering with the report of the Investigation and Identification Team, the IIT, and their new investigative practices. We've also seen cooperation between the OPCW and the IIIM, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism in relation to Syria, which is a key justice facilitator, and which has assisted with over 130 distinct national investigations. We've also seen a lot of complaints at the domestic level in relation to use of chemical weapons over the past years. Also, the issue could not be more timely in the context of state responsibility. The Netherlands and Canada just filed an application before the International Court of Justice under the dispute settlement clause under the UN Convention Against Torture. Another milestone is UNITAD's work on the chemical weapon program by ISIL. Earlier this month, UNITAD reported in its 10th report to the Security Council that ISIL produced at least 8 chemical agents, and that the team is working actively with Iraq and other countries to build cases linked to 12 chemical weapons attacks, and at least 21 persons suspected of being affiliated with ISIL's chemical weapons program. So this really raises, I think, novel issues in relation to how do we deal with accountability, also in relation to non-state actors. So the macro questions for this panel are, how can we actually enforce the red line and move beyond the mere investigation, fact-finding to attribution and criminal responsibility? And not only how can we facilitate effective, but also potentially fair investigation and prosecutions, and how can we prevent the emergence of the use of chemical weapons in future conflicts, also through response to uses that we witnessed in the past. So we have 3 wonderful panelists. They're not complete strangers to those of you who are in The Hague. We expected former prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, but we were just informed that she has to present her credentials to the King of Sweden this afternoon. So unfortunately, she could not be with us. So there might be exonerating circumstances in legal terms, I think, for her not to participate in this meeting. We have Dr. Olufemi Elias. He was registrar of the International Residual Mechanisms for Criminal Tribunals, and of course he served as legal advisor for the OPCW. He also worked for the UN Compensation Commission in Geneva, and he is also a visiting professor at Queen Mary University in London. So, Femi, you're both a practitioner and you also have an academic hat. So, welcome. It's wonderful to have your perspectives today. Then we have Michelle Jarvis, who's the deputy head of the IIIM. Prior to that, many of you from The Hague will know her as deputy to the prosecutor of the ICTY and to the mechanism for international criminal tribunals. She also initiated the prosecuting conflict-related sexual violence network, and she's also a wonderful editor of a wonderful volume also on this. So it's wonderful to have you back, Michelle, and to share your experiences. And lastly, we have Mr. Christian Ritter, Special Advisor and Head of Unitat. He had a distinguished career in the German legal system. He served as a federal public prosecutor at the German Federal Court of Justice, and he was head of the German War Crimes Unit S4, which is responsible for the investigation and prosecution of international crimes, also in Iraq and Syria. So, Christian, we are very delighted that you joined us from Baghdad in New York to share your most recent insights on the topic today. We will focus the discussion on 4 themes. First of all, the international legal framework governing responsibility for the use of chemical weapons. Secondly, some of the evidentiary challenges that we face. Then certainly some of the options to prosecute crimes. And then lastly, ways to enhance cooperation, sharing of material and information, and also development of good practices. So also looking forward to how can we move ahead from here. So we thought rather than doing individual presentations, we will do this session in a dialogue or conversation, also to make it more interactive, to go into greater depth, and also to, I think, keep you on your toes. And afterwards, we move into the Q&A part, and afterwards, you will be invited to a reception. So without further ado, let's move directly, I think, into this discussion, the issues that all of you are interested in. And let's first of all, maybe talk a little bit about the legal framework. Is our international legal framework governing criminal responsibility for the use of chemical weapons sufficient? And maybe also what is particular about investigating and prosecuting use of chemical weapons compared to the many other crimes that we have under international. So, Michelle, maybe you want to start?
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. It really is a pleasure to be back here in The Hague. As Carsten said, I have spent many years of my career here, and the last 5 years in Geneva working for IIIM Syria. So I think the combined perspective makes for an interesting contribution to the discussion. You asked about legal frameworks, and I think there probably are other panelists who are very well placed for that. I would say, from the perspective of the IIIM Syria, the legal framework is certainly not the biggest challenge that we have when it comes to our chemical weapons work. Just to situate it a little bit for the audience, I know some of you will be familiar with the IIIM's mandate and work, others maybe less so. There's quite a novel idea created by the General Assembly in 2016 because of the political blockages on the Syrian situation that meant there weren't other justice avenues available. So the mechanism is not a court or tribunal, but has been set up to do the preparatory work to assist other justice actors. So we collect evidence, we consolidate, we preserve, and we analyse it to prepare for criminal proceedings. We don't have actually a statute as such, so we are working a lot with customary international law frameworks and, of course, the frameworks of the jurisdictions that we support. And currently, that's primarily the jurisdictions who are exercising universal or other forms of extraterritorial jurisdiction in relation to crimes in Syria. And there are quite a number of those. The IIIM assists already 15 different jurisdictions. So for us, it's about making sure that our work is really tailored to those specific jurisdictions and the legal frameworks they have. I think there's probably going to be some comments very specifically on offences that relate directly to chemical weapons. One thing I would say is that, of course, there are many ways under the criminal law frameworks for prosecuting these offences beyond the offences that actually relate to prohibited weapons, poisonous weapons, asphyxiating weapons. We can use general frameworks like crimes against humanity, persecution, inhumane treatment. I know many of you will be wondering about the issue of chemical weapons and torture. We have an interesting development this week with an application before the International Court of Justice by the Netherlands and Canada, where the use of chemical weapons has actually been raised as part of a claim coming underneath the Torture Convention. So I think that's something we can return back to. So legal frameworks, I think for us is that there's a lot to work with. We can use general categories as well as specific categories if recipient jurisdictions have them in the framework. I think there are lots of technical challenges, lots of particular aspects of chemical weapons investigations that I'm happy to go into, but perhaps I can stop there and allow some of the others to weigh.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me here for this very interesting discussion. I'm really honored to be here in the Hague again. Well, actually, as you know, I'm usually based in Baghdad. Let me a little bit explain about the mandate. It's in a way similar to what Michelle just mentioned about triple line, with a very, very important distinction, because UNITAD was established by the Security Council of the General Assembly on the request of Iraq. That is most important. So we are in the host country, we're situated in the host country, we're situated in Baghdad, and we are doing our investigative work, or at least most of it, within Iraq. That is most important. We are in a very close cooperation with Iraqi authorities, in particular with the Iraqi judiciary, exchange of thoughts and cooperation with the Iraqi judges, and every day's work. So that is most important. Actually, of course, that is not a prosecution service and not a court or something like this in the investigative team. So we're doing investigative work, and in the end, what we work in the end are case reports about our findings. That is important to know. In terms of the legal framework, I would actually would repeat what you said. For us, it is customary international law. It is what is codified in the statutes of the STY and STR. It is, of course, the judgments of these two international courts, and in addition, whenever we share information, we support member states in their efforts of jurisdiction is the respective national legal framework in terms of international criminal law. That is so that means that whenever it comes to chemical weapons, we do investigative work under the aspect of war crimes, under the aspect of crimes against humanity, maybe well, depending on the circumstances. You can even think about genocide. Maybe we come to that later. But actually, what is important for us is that we're doing the investigative work. In the beginning, we're investigating the crimes committed by ISIL in Iraq, and even by using chemical weapons. And the second step then is just to be what that might be on the legal list. So if this constitutes an act of a war crime or a crime against humanity, whatever. What is interesting as well is that, particularly in terms of supporting national prosecution services, most of them, well, in terms of, I sort of think about membership in a terrorist organization. So that is an important aspect from our perspective as well. And actually, what you can do is something like cumulative prosecution, that you have an act which might constitute a crime of aggression, let's say, a crime against humanity or a war crime, and similarly, it's an act of membership in a terrorist organization. So it's some what we call accumulated prosecution, that you have these two aspects linked together. That is what some member states in the United Nations do in their jurisdiction, like for example Germany, they always have these two aspects of criminal liability linked together. Is it sufficient? Well, I think from my point of view, this is at least something we can work on. So, prosecutor or investigator does not always ask, is it sufficient or not? Or maybe they do if there's no legislation at all. But in general, if there's a legislation, we work with the legislation which is in place, because that is the practitioner's approach. We will not ask, well, it would be nice to have something different, but we have to use the tools we have. Otherwise, it would not work. And so that is actually our approach, and this is what we are currently doing in our industry. Maybe I can hand over to you. Academic aspect.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Real want to be here. Thank you for attending. Yeah, it's potentially like a minor question. Legal training or sentences framework. We're talking about, for instance, looking at that in terms of institution sense. Because in many ways, maybe this is generated. I think this is really important. The fact that you don't have an institution that will apply what I consider to be the wealth of standards in this case of law that exists. And the many ways that's delivery of the products of the control to see them. John, that's it. The best. Yes, so it's the domestic jurisdiction that's the left, international forum is the left, and hybrid. These are important. For me, this is the big thing. I say this because I believe that aside from the institutional aspect, the origin and substantive and speaking about general we all know you have two elements, like certain goods and customary international laws, essentially something that it's not deliberate, it's the difference from principle. However, what you do in this case is the articulation of that customary international law. I think that what we need to be sharp is to use the parity, different standards and rules that are quite the normal discussion of standards in this context is that it could be said that so authoritative articulation of the sense. And just to be clear with our those based in legal framework is as the prohibition of the use of chemical at certain stage to be investigation. We have so much that it's should be nice to have some engagement through the General Assembly or there's other ECW saying use of chemicals by anybody, anytime it's contrary to international law, the traders should be punished. And we have these general statements. That to fall before tribunal or court to be able to have that given the roundness to the propositions. So I think that the most important gap in this short program is who is going to articulate it. And again, in this context, we look at the CWC as well. The chemical workers convention, as you know, we're talking about individual responsibilities. You have Article 7. That's what state parties to implement the convention by national legislation. That is one of the very clear obligations to say that under the CWC. While the record of implementation of the convention might not be perfect, because the gravity of the legislation does not cover everything that it should. What they do cover The offenses in Article 1 of the Capital Convention, which are the names related use, transfers, stockpiling, wiring, etc. of technologies. Even if national legislation is not sufficient in other aspects, it only has 2016, 76% of national legislation and of country handbooks say that 74% of their commissions offenses. 66% of them have provisions for extraterritorial on the basis of nationality. So those are, there's enough out there about chemical convention itself as a national institution concern. Well, we move on to questions like, what about anything beyond that? For instance, only 6 of the 193 states parties are provisions implementing the CWC on the basis of the station. So they only 6 countries see the chemical convention recommends it. Okay, take its so they don't say that. Only 6 countries have the institutions. That's not to say, Michelle has given examples of the institutions that do that, not on the basis of the CWC, but it's other kinds of tests. But if we look at chemical weapons or kinds of thefts, then it becomes very, very important. And you note that there is CWC implementation in that respect. But we still do have the creative criminalized individual pieces, those sanctions. One important as party, for instance, is the Syrian Republic, for instance, the national legislation is look at institutions as far as where this time Syria has not enacted a Article 7 legislation yet. Those chemical weapons convention has not been translated to Syria. The question is then, is this prohibited under custom international law? That states can apply universal jurisdiction. I think this is not speculatively used and actually form the basis. Again, what is the application for? Things, but I think that's what it takes to is core mechanisms to apply all these tasks in the great.
So from the trivia, I think just the figure that only 6 states have universal jurisdiction in relation to the defense of the chemical weapons convention. I think it's a pretty remarkable finding as to the difficulties, right? So nevertheless, I think the trend has been mainly going more to customary prohibition. As you mentioned, we've had the toughest adjustments, which result also the individual responsibility in non-international armed conflict. We have the ICC customary study. So in relation to the use of chemical weapons, I think in times of armed conflict, you would really say in terms of the law, even in peacetime rights, we had at least ruling over European Guardian rights with the fundamental attacks like that. There's a customary provision not to use chemical weapons. Also advanced against humanity. So I think if we talk about the use, we have a critical sector legally. I think the difficulties are what if we talk about what Christian and Police are doing, developing a chemical weapons program. It's not the use, it's a preparatory act, it's the development of it. So do we rely simply on domestic law to do that? Can we use international crime prohibition to do that? I think that's where the really interesting question. So the other really interesting issue is we've had so few experiences. We have this training source, which was customary law, but if we look at actual investigations and prosecutions, we see that use of chemical weapons is really an under-prosecuted crime, I would say. And I think it would be really interesting to gather maybe some views on the panel. Why is that? What are the reasons that we have some few trials, that actually relate, to that prohibition of use chemical weapons?
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I think in the context of Syria, it is definitely a paradox that we have so much documentation and so many organisations established to look into the issue of use of chemical weapons in Syria. But as of today, no indictment and no conviction for these offences. So is it a question of political will? I don't see that in the context of Syria. When it comes to the work that we do at IIIM, I think there has been a lot of support for the idea of accountability for chemical weapons. If you look at the very resolution creating the IIIM and our terms of reference, there's an express statement about the fact that the IIIM was expected to collect material that had already been developed by the OPCW United Nations Joint Investigation Mechanism. So the idea was that we would start with the benefit of those investigations that had already been undertaken. The OPCW, of course, has been investigating alleged use of chemical weapons since an early stage of the conflict in Syria. The fact-finding mission, of course, its involvement in the joint investigation mechanism, and now currently the IIT, the investigation and identification team. And these are all organisations that have been investigating, not necessarily with a view to attributing to individual perpetrators, but certainly confirming whether chemical weapons have been used in Syria, and going some way towards attribution to at least different parties to the conflict. And so findings being made about multiple use of chemical weapons by Syrian government, but also in relation to Daesh as well. So we had, of course, the Commission of Inquiry for Syria, a UN Human Rights Council mandated fact-finding body that has also been documenting use of chemical weapons in Syria, and an enormous volume of documentation being undertaken by civil society actors, particularly Syrian civil society actors, who are and have been present on the ground in Syria and able to respond in a contemporaneous way when chemical weapons attacks have happened, and to safeguard evidence and transmission. So we have all of this documentation. The problem is, of course, that none of it has been done with a view to criminal proceedings specifically. And so these bodies like the OPCW, the Commission of Inquiry for Syria, are working under different standards of proof, and usually a sort of reasonable grounds to believe basis rather than a beyond reasonable doubt. So that's where a body like the IIIM can come in and add that next layer of analysis and evidence gathering to prepare files that could be trial ready under criminal law standards beyond a reasonable doubt. But there is definitely a lot of additional work that needs to be done based on this excellent foundation that has been created by others. But of course, as we've said, we also need an outlet for that work. So the IIIM, over the course of its work, has been accumulating a vast amount of material from these other bodies in its central repository of information and evidence. We're analysing it, we're determining where the evidentiary gaps are, and we're using our investigative mandate to fill those gaps. Then we are dependent on jurisdictions who are willing to take up these cases to prosecute individuals for these offences. And maybe just to give you an idea of some of the hurdles, the IIIM in the course of its work has had now 280 requests for assistance from 15 different jurisdictions. Of those 280 requests, only 5 relate to chemical weapons issues. So you can see the limited activity on chemical weapons in the jurisdictions that are working on universal or extraterritorial jurisdiction frameworks. So nevertheless, with the IIIM, we are continuing in our structural investigation to develop case files so that we have these more developed packages of evidence and legal argument available that we can channel through to jurisdictions who might be willing to receive them. And we do have indications that when our case files are at an advanced stage, there are some jurisdictions who would be open to receiving that material from the IIIM. So that's what we continue to work on in that regard.
I think, question from your experience, moving on to the actual files, might be kind of breakthrough, also incentivizing the Western jurisdictions to actor. But what you all have a double hat of having certain German judiciary, it gives you only of UK thing. So maybe you could also go a little bit into the question, why is it under prosecution?
Thank you so much. I think quite a lot of what Michelle just mentioned and also for us about. Because the unit is only investigating crimes committed by ISIL in Iraq. So we're not focusing on any other specific perpetrator in terms of use of chemical and development of chemical weapons. We're focusing on crimes committed by ISIL in that regard. And actually, ISIL not only used but also developed chemical weapons between 2014 and 2017 in Iraq. So that is something of course is subject of our mandate and of course is subject of our investigative work. In that regard, we, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are cooperating very much with the Iraqi authorities and the Iraqi judiciary. We had a side event at the headquarters of the United Nations last week in New York, while presenting our investigative work on the use of chemical weapons and development of chemical weapons. Judge Ali Jabbar from the investigation board that Tazar Komatu gave an overview of what was done by the Iraqi judiciary in terms of investigations regarding the use of chemical weapons by ISIL, and additionally, my lead investigator on this regard gave another presentation from the UNITA perspective. There's a lot of overlap, of course, because as we are cooperating. Actually, in Iraq, the judiciary and the competent authorities gathered a lot of evidence, and actually we are supporting the Iraqi authorities in terms of analyzing digitization. It's a very important topic in that regard. Pastor already mentioned that we up to now we digitized more than 8 million documents left behind by ISIL perpetrators when they retreated, so that they are now acceptable and they are researchable, and you can analyze them and put them in a structured repository and in a structured archive where you can use them. One day a legal framework is in place and is adopted in Iraq in terms of international criminal law. There is actually one of these challenges we were facing. Well, some we just mentioned that some national some nations, some states have not yet adopted a domestic legal framework on international crimes. Nevertheless, we go on with our investigative work and are developing strategies in order to investigate these kind of crimes. We are doing that in the way you just described as well, like having a structural base of the use of chemical weapons by ISIL, focusing on emblematic attacks of ISIL on specific villages and targets in Iraq, which happened particularly in 2016 when ISIL on the order of the supreme leaders of ISIL started attacks on villages in Iraq using chemical weapons like mortars and rockets with agents and chemical substances in there. What is interesting as well, I think this is something you have to take into account when it comes to accountability and why we don't have a lot of cases solved. There is a tendency internationally to give them more robust answer on the use of chemical weapons, unilateral answer, meaning using of methods of warfare to answer these attacks, and in the end well, some of the perpetrators who were responsible for the use of chemical weapons are not alive after these kind of attacks anymore. So that is, if you go into history, you will find examples for this approach. And well, that is something, well, that happens, even the supreme leader of ISIL, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is not alive anymore. So we have strong indications that he ordered the use of chemical weapons. He himself really ordered to use chemical weapons in Iraq and attack civilians. And
But can I push this one? We need to deploy a network to establish that tie of expertise and data. So how do we go after the network?
well, in terms of the network, of course, it would be desirable to have a network of investigative bodies who are working together. We have the OPCW, we are cooperating with the OPCW as well. And in the end, well, I can only answer this question from my perspective in UNITA. And we have a very good understanding on the side of our Iraqi counterparts that the use of chemical weapons is something that is really a priority in terms of investigative work. I don't see that actually in that broad sense on the international level. There's, I think it is very specific that the Iraqi authorities, they have a very direct experience with the use of chemical weapons, are well aware and that there has something to be done in terms of this, and they are pushing for the investigative work there. This is not. I see some appetite here in the United States, in particular in Europe, but not that to that extent that a lot of countries would request for support coming from UNITA. Well, the numbers you just mentioned, it's more or less the same on our side as well. I actually don't remember requests for support from member states of the United Nations in terms of the use of chemical weapons investigations.
So let's maybe move on to our second block on the evidentiary questions. You obviously have really tapped into IAM, you're really pioneering in the sense that you're collecting evidence that should be admissible in courts everywhere in the world, and also in relation to international courts and tribunals. And this is obviously a very demanding task, given the diversity of legal systems, the differences in evidence law, which you already referred to also lie to different standards of proof, etc. So it seems to be that there's no shortage of evidence on crimes, but the main question is how to produce evidence that is able to stand in court. So how do you create that record? How do you deal with a large amount of information? How do you make it accessible to other jurisdictions so that they can actually use your information? What are your suggestions?
You can really use it.
Okay. Yeah, of course. UNITA's mandate is it goes through association and collecting evidence and highest confidence standard. So what we use is standard used to form high confidence experiences. So of course it's about analyzing documents. I thought from my point of view, I can say I thought was a huge bureaucracy. I thought it's incredible how many documents. I just mentioned these 8 million documents. That's only part of what they left behind when they retreated there. So it's incredible to what extent UNITA was able to collect documents from ISIL perpetrators, including lists of salary and list of members, staff members, and so on and so. And you can imagine that it's evidence which is really important for us, because it leads to the point that we can say, okay, these and that persons are responsible for these type of crimes, and who ordered the crimes and so on. Actually, in the end, of course, we very much rely on evidence which is shared with us by the Iraqi authorities in terms of use of chemical weapons, analyzing mortars and devices which were used during the attacks on villages. For example, like in 2016, pieces of rockets, pieces of mortars, and so on. We of course use medical reports on victims which were attacked by these kind of weapons. And we of course have a lot of evidence coming from testimonies from victims gathered both by the UNITA and by the investigative judges of the Iraqi judiciary. So this is the material we use, and we are of course cross-checking that, and we are using that in a proper way in our case briefs, so that these pieces of evidence can be used once it is necessary, and wherever it is necessary in a court of law, in a fair trials against alleged perpetrators. That is the usual work of a careful prosecutor, and careful investigator is what we do.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, well, I mean, you of course put your finger on one of the most challenging aspects of these justice facilitation mandates, like the IIIM and UNITAD. We have a sister entity working on Myanmar as well. But of course, what we've been asked to do is to prepare work that can assist as yet unidentified actors in unidentified jurisdictions. So it is very difficult to know what kind of procedural or substantive legal frameworks are going to apply to the dossiers that are transmitted by the IIIM in most instances. So there's another even more challenging aspect to the mandate, in that it's not only justice opportunities that may exist currently that we are preparing for, but also future justice opportunities for institutions that may not have even yet been created. So we have no idea what kind of legal frameworks, procedural or substantive, they will apply. So it's very challenging, and it requires a lot of creativity and agility, I would say. I mean, no surprise to hear me say what that means in practice is that we've got to develop internal procedures that allow us to maximise the chances that the way we have approached the preservation of the evidence and the handling of it is going to be satisfactory to a recipient jurisdiction, regardless of their framework. So that does mean a lot of really meticulous work around the way we handle chain of custody, provenance of materials. I mentioned that we start with this idea of collecting material already collected by other actors, CCW, inquiry, civil society. And as you can imagine, there's all sorts of different practices when it comes to recording chain of custody and provenance. So for us, we need to make sure that at least when we have the material, we have a very rigorous approach to chain of custody. But we also have to spend a lot of time trying to reconstruct chain of custody and provenance for materials that we get from other actors, where that may not have been a priority at the time that the material was collected, and that especially applies to civil society. So that's one of the big evidentiary challenges for chemical weapons work, is just the highly complex technical scientific nature of the evidence that we need to work with. And it's not only samples collected from impact sites, but of course we're having to layer in all sorts of expert evidence, medical evidence, toxicology, obviously chemical weapons expertise, weapon systems, flight data tracking in the context of Syria. So this is part of the reason why it takes a long time to prepare the case files, and why we may not see so many jurisdictions easily taking up the chemical weapons cases without a lot of support from a justice facilitator like the IIIM. Maybe just to say a couple of other things about some of the particular evidentiary challenges we've faced at the IIIM. Yeah, I mean, clearly highly technical scientific evidence and expertise is needed. We've also seen in the context of Syria that when allegations have been made about chemical weapons use by the OPCW and other organisations, that alleged perpetrators have come back with a whole range of challenges to those processes, whether it's that the organisations are not independent and impartial, coming up with alternative hypotheses about who might be responsible for the attacks. So part of our work is anticipating and trying to make sure that we can rebut in the case files that we prepare these types of challenges to evidence. One thing I did want to mention, which I think is insufficiently understood when it comes to chemical weapons, is that we see a real gender differential in the impact of these attacks on the victims and survivors. We tend to think in international criminal law that gender equates to sexual violence or other forms of gender-based violence, but here's a really good example of how a gender analysis is really crucial in all aspects of the work that we do. We know that women and girls have very different experiences and consequences as a result of chemical weapons. The health impact is different. Their access to medical treatment is very different, but we see them being severely underrepresented in the documentation work that is done. So we've had a good opportunity at IIIM to see what has been collected by others, and we know that these voices are severely underrepresented. So I think for us as an international community and international justice actors, that's something that we really focus on, is trying to fill those gaps and making sure that the case files we're putting together are really representative of the full range of experiences, regardless of gender or other factors.
Just a very quick one, is to comment on what Michelle said. My question is going to be to you. Recalling what happened to the JIM, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, and the fact that it wasn't expanded, which that situation on GB is not really possible to enforce that situation from establishment and of course the very we will recall that one of the most important pieces, but not the challenges made by perpetrators and the supporters to say, you know, that this is not properly, that it was done by the branch, or that some visits were not, you know, undertaken. So this is to the extent that the IIIM is using, taking that kind of evidence in terms of you take additional steps on based on evidence, which are the challenges based. I mean, you address the question a little bit, but the specific, how would you think, for instance, evidence you get from the gym that is apparently not based on scientific, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's inherent in our whole model of justice facilitation, this issue of, okay, we're an independent, impartial body, we receive material from others. How do we make sure that we're not just accepting at face value the conclusions that they have drawn? And that's been a really important part of the way that we've organised our work and our overall approach at the IIIM. We collect broadly and we take an independent look at the material and make our own assessment. And of course, as I mentioned before, we are working to a different standard as well, and a higher standard under criminal law frameworks. So we spend a lot of time combing through the material, really digging into those issues around chain of custody, provenance, credibility of witnesses. We have the advantage that we're aggregating material from so many different sources. So that helps us because we can see the overall strength and consistency of evidence. We can see where there may be gaps that are problematic, and we can take proactive steps to fill it. But there are issues and challenges that will always be there. And you mentioned the inability to always attend a crime scene, to be able to do really fast impact analysis at a crime scene. That's a reality. So those are things that we have to build into our methodology and find other ways to corroborate. I think it's also another advantage of the IIIM is that, I mean, our mandate is not limited to chemical weapons in the way that the OPCW is. So what we have done to try and strengthen the overall case files is to see the connections between the chemical weapons attacks and conventional weapons attacks. So in Syria, what we often see are chemical weapons attacks being either preceded or followed by conventional weapons attacks that might, for example, target medical facilities as a way of disabling the response capacity to a chemical weapons attack. And so when we can step back and have a bigger picture view of what are the passions, what seems to be the underlying purposes driving these crimes, then we can also strengthen the case theory that is being put forward in the disease.
Yeah. And I just push you on two more points on this issue. So I think what Charlotte mentioned about the gender differential impact, I think it's really interesting. So the first time I actually hear that. But I want to come back to the value of your investigations, and I think one question that a lot of defense lawyers would ask, how we secure that also get timelines and fairness, the protections are adequately taken, so do you want to share exonerating evidence, so how do you deal with that side? On one field of evidence. And the second question is, I think it would be interesting to look at domestic investigation. What is that according to your experience, would be then a kind of independent additional domestic investigation in order to proceed to the trial. So how much work will domestic systems need to do after you share, after both established you had information and go out and share your information? So do you have already had any experience in this?
I can certainly jump in on the second point about additional investigations once jurisdictions receive material from the IIIM. And I think the answer is it varies a lot depending on the circumstances. I think it's always going to be the case that a recipient jurisdiction, a prosecutor in a national system or even an international court is going to want to make their own assessment of the evidence that the IIIM has compiled in the analysis and make the case ready from their own perspective and in accordance with their own legal framework and a procedural framework. So I think it's very unlikely that there would ever be a scenario where a case file that we've developed could just be transplanted into a court within the next day or week or month. There is always going to be a certain amount of translation into that jurisdiction and that particular prosecutor's own assessment of the strength of the case. With IIIM as well, we're using a model whereby we have our structural investigation and we have one line of inquiry in the structural investigation on unlawful attacks, and that's where our work on chemical weapons sits, and as I mentioned, it's linked with our work on conventional weapons as well. And we are designing this in a way that it's not only full case files that we can transfer to jurisdictions, but maybe smaller blocks of analytical work that might come up in the investigations that they're undertaking. And I mentioned the 5 requests for assistance that we've received. So these were not requests for whole case files, but they were requests for things like, IIIM, have you done analysis of a particular structure that we believe is involved in chemical weapons production? And can you tell us how this structure was working and how it was linked in with other things? So we can detach that effectively from our line of inquiry and channel it into the jurisdiction. Or there might be very technical questions around chemical precursors, that sort of thing. So it really all depends. And of course, the more time we have to work on our case files, I think the bigger head start a jurisdiction will have. And I think we are collectively accumulating a lot of work that really could be an excellent foundation for a jurisdiction if ever one was created for chemical weapons specifically.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, what you just mentioned, Michelle, what you told us as well, of course, very much depends on the respective requesting national jurisdiction. As you just rightly mentioned, we will, even if we have a case brief on, let's say, the use of chemical weapons and that and this and that village, for example, and even if we identify specific perpetrators, and this will probably not just transfer into an indictment. So it's even if we we have knowledge, for example, that a specific perpetrator is currently living in a member state of the United Nations, and we deliver proactively this case brief to that respective competent authority of that country. Probably there will be additional investigations coming from that side, and there will be questions. And actually, as you just mentioned, the deliveries, that's the same. We have the same experience. The requests are very specified and saying, well, we are interested in this or that specific incident. If you have additional information, or can you share information about this or that person, or please can you interview this or that witness or victim, because this interview is necessary for our investigative mind. So it is hardly to predict what will be necessary one day. And actually, in terms of the first part of your question, that we can, how to ensure the protection of their trial rights and the rights of the defense, that's really outside the mandate. Actually, we're not an entity which has to make sure that that everything is going right. Of course, we're going to have safeguards in terms of sharing of evidence. That is, of course, true, because we have to act in accordance with UN best practices and UN policy. That is pretty natural, but we are not the ones who are monitoring what's going on with respective jurisdiction. That is not the mandate. That is more the human rights.
But anyway, you obviously have in mind how your evidence will be challenged in court, so I mean, you definitely anticipate lines of defense in relation to the evidence of the client rights. So, thinking from your perspective, from the OPCW, when we talk about strengthening enforcement, would you have any recommendations how the mandate of the organization could be strengthened, and how universal protection could be strengthened to facilitate more effective investigation?
Do I have any recommendations? This, I don't think this is necessarily a problem of supervision itself. Obviously, this is a problem of prosecution itself. We all know that there is challenges. There's a few extracted by jurisdiction. It's criticized for being very Eurocentric approach. The countries have more the ability to enforce that trade than we expect. So, for me, it is. I don't think it's something that can be easily interpreted as a part of the CWC into the approaches, especially because we saw the countries implementing the controls that the legislation don't provide territoriality and anti-person. So I'm not sure what it is that would make universal jurisdiction more acceptable under the CWC than anywhere else. So on that one, I have to say no, I don't have any recommendation, not on that particular point. But I think that one of the most important things that the technical secretariat leaders is to assist in implementing the legislation. And the record is not always good, but it improves, keep going on. So that, particularly in case of coming back Syria, for instance, that will adopt the legislation for the future, but of course, that's never something that will create uncertainty. But I think that kind of level of part of the doubling down, showing that the states implement the legislation. And it will certainly bridge the gap. There is a gap there. Each country does it on its own. Will address the issue. That doesn't solve the problem. It's necessarily solve the problem because many of the countries that support, for instance, seriously that if Article 7 is considered, that would be the only country that has the power under the convention to prosecute Syria would be Syria itself and nobody else. So which might not be ideal, but not to be enforcement in that regard. So I think the structure of the CWC is such that I'm not sure that there's much more that can be done in terms of broadening the jurisdiction the states have. Right, so I think it's not in the state of the jurisdiction. I'm not sure.
Thank you, the domestic victims were built on the work of the INT and not the technical assistance that you give. But we might have to think about the broader array of functions. And I think that leads us to the question that in some discussions on whether there might be feasibility for special harmless tribunal. Is that realistic? And maybe what are also the options in relation to state responsibility for use of chemical weapons. I already mentioned the new ICJ applications. So I would like to maybe seek some views. Obviously, knowing that you come from an institution perspective and evidence to what you can say. Anyway, I saw that it would be interesting to explore what are potential alternative options in relation to domestic or jurisdictions to move forward. Michelle.
Thanks, Carsten. Yeah, I think you can't do this work over many years like we have at the IIIM without really thinking a lot about this issue of how can we find a more effective outlet for the work that has been done. We have so much documentation, so much meticulous analysis, building all the time towards case files that would be withstanding criminal law thresholds against individual perpetrators. But the reality is today that we have so few ways of seeing those cases being brought to court. We mentioned domestic jurisdictions, universal jurisdiction and other forms of extraterritorial jurisdiction. We shouldn't give up on that, definitely. We have encouraging signs that there may be some jurisdictions willing to do that in the future. But there are still going to be limits about access to or being able to apprehend perpetrators and certainly moving up the chain of command to the senior level perpetrators. So from our point of view and having spent an extensive amount of time speaking with victims and survivors of crimes in Syria, including chemical weapons attacks, I think we have to conclude that as an international community, we should be looking at every possible justice opportunity for these crimes, given their gravity, given the universal condemnation, which is beyond dispute, but we have an impunity gap, and it's something that I think we should all feel is unacceptable, and we should be looking at all creative options to this. There is, I think, interesting momentum building behind a proposal for a sort of collective delegated jurisdiction court. There have been meetings held, expert meetings. There have been diplomatic consultations on this, and I think that's the kind of proposal that is worthy of consideration as a possible outlet. For the IIIM, we would certainly stand ready to support any jurisdiction, and that would really be the ideal scenario, is to have a way of being able to really channel the work that we've been doing to make justice opportunities. I mentioned the ICJ case earlier. I think of course, so far what we've seen in the application filed by the Netherlands and Canada, we know that chemical weapons usage is in there as one of the aspects of violation of the Torture Convention, whether it's torture or cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment. So we eagerly await the memorials to see how those documents are going to be developed. I think for victims and survivors, it's a good example of how we don't have to accept that the blockages we currently face mean there's no avenues for proceeding, and it is about just working with the tools that we have and insisting that we will push those justice opportunities wherever and whenever they arise.
Well, yeah, that's my point of view as well, in the way that obviously we have a quite different situation with military as we are in the country itself, and of course, according to the mandate, Iraq is the primary intended recipient of products Unitas. So what we want to achieve, what we want to see is the evidence-based fair trials in Iraqi courts against perpetrators, also including of course perpetrators which were contributed to the use of chemical weapons against the Iraqi population. That is what we are working on, and well, we see a lot of appetite within the Iraqi judiciary to cooperate with us. This is why we will just now currently improving our joint case study together with the Iraqi judges in order to well, in the end, produce case files which both sides are contributing, like the Iraqi judiciary contributing with pieces of evidence and the unit as well. These case files, first and foremost, now will be case files on cases against perpetrators who are living abroad, outside Iraq, in countries where there is a domestic legislation of international crimes, so that we can share this case files with these respective prosecution services in the country. And then once domestic legislation is adopted in Iraq, we will move on to joint case files, joint case study in Iraq as well. That is currently what we are doing, we're intensifying this, because in the end it's about avoiding impunity gaps. That's of course true, and actually we are working against the time. Though in the end there's no statute of limitation on international crime, so it is a challenge under several aspects. In the end, what we would have, I think that holds true for IIIN as well. We would have in the end is a legacy kind of evidence repository, which is easily acceptable even in 20 years, 30 years, whenever perpetrators are held accountable for the international crimes they committed. In our case, ISIL perpetrators. That is something what we need to do, and well, it's always difficult to look into the future and to assess what's going to happen one day. But in the end, it should be at least possible to have these trials and to have these trials even in 20, 30 years. So it is quite demanding, but actually this is, I think, our duty in the end, what we have to do.
Can I just put a little bit on the focal point? I understand that most of the Iraqi prisoners that we test on prisoners in relation to this water allegation. Did you come across any evidence where
yes,
the bigger government?
Yeah, that is part of our investigations currently. Well, chemical substances were tested on prisoners of ISIL. Even the fatal results. That is something where we have indications on. That is well, in a way, as an aspect of our investigative work, that not only of course, the use of chemical weapons against villages or civil population, but as well in the development. Of course, in a way, were of course in itself crimes, international crimes, not only as cases about aiding and abetting of the use of chemical weapons, but the development itself could be cases of, let's say, crimes against humanity or war crimes by these kind of testing against captured people. Officials of Iraqi officials which were captured by ISIL and had an intention of them used as human, so to say, human. How to say that? Yeah, persons who are well going to be subject of these testings.
Yeah, human experiments.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like rabbits, yeah.
Exactly.
So my last question is
I just think about this IT case. I think it's been fascinating. I haven't seen them in more say. We've known that the convention has been a good jurisdictional book in the past, but that was specifically the IC reaching out to the evidence. The gym, but I'm going to have the reports of the FFM and the gym as standardized and upgraded by the IIM, scrutinized by the ICM. It's very exciting.
Yeah, what I can say is that IIIM certainly stands ready to support the ICJ proceeding. Hard to know what the ICJ will do, but no, I mean, I think this is a really important justice opportunity for Syrian convicted survivors, not only on the chemical weapons issue, on the torture in Syrian prisons more generally, but the fact that the issue of chemical weapons has been raised in the application, I think is an important part of that as well, and we stand ready. We have, I mentioned our structural investigation lines of inquiry. One of them is unlawful attacks, including chemical weapons, but we have another line of inquiry on detention-related crimes, so we're well placed to be able to.
Expatriate responsibility is definitely another option, for sure.
Yeah, definitely in relation to the asset network was going to be against us saying what difference also provision of material evidence highlighted by the IIIM as a commission of inquiry or they know that there was stepping in favor of all of these genocide water cases. So I think this is one of the most significant developments in the international dynamics. So let's maybe look for the last question before we are going to Q&A. So if we think about cooperation and assistance in relation to evidence, if we think about taking the future, what would be your wish list? So how could the structure be improved? What recommendations would you have? We have a lot of practitioners here, we have ambassadors. So what would you say? What would we need in order to provide an effective cooperation regime and look into the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to look at it through the lens of anything is possible, what would we want? Actually, I think that we have seen some really good precedents being set here already. I mentioned the number of organisations who have worked on chemical weapons in the context of Syria. And of course, the challenge was that the first of those organisations, like the Commission of Inquiry for Syria, the fact-finding mission of the OPCW, was set up at a time before the IIIM was even thought of. So that creates some challenges around sharing material, even with the best of intentions, because there are consent issues that need to be sorted out and these can be time consuming. However, the IIT, the investigative and identification team of the OPCW, was set up after the IIIM was already in existence. And there we see from the beginning of their work already planning for the transfer of their material to the IIIM and other relevant actors. So I think that kind of coordinated framework from the beginning is extremely useful. So it's really thinking through the whole process of what sort of documentation do we need to collect, who's doing that work, what are the standards, what are the purposes for which they're collecting, and how can we maximise the prospect that that material can be shared easily among all of the actors who need to access it. So some positive examples already, but probably more that we can do in terms of thinking through those coordinated frameworks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, from my point of view, it would be really good if the work that is doing is really requested by our partners. We are currently in cooperation with 17 member states of the United Nations, plus Iraq, of course. So maybe this can be improved as well, and it would be good from our point of view. Well, we are kind of an offer to Iraq and to the international community as well. We can deliver evidence, and we can deliver information, and support member states holding license perpetrators accountable in a way that is quite unique, because we are the country itself. We are at the source of evidence, and we can deliver tailored information, which is necessary to hold license perpetrators accountable wherever they are in the world. And this is something that should be really be requested, because actually it's not only well, it's called finance by the international community, so the international community should make use of it. And we are happy to assist we are happy to assist our Iraqi counterparts in terms of holding ISIS perpetrators accountable for the international crimes they committed. So it's from our point of view, it would be always a good idea to not only look into membership in a terrorist organization in terms of holding ISIS perpetrators accountable, but to look into the other crimes, the underlying crimes. So they probably allegedly had committed. And then these crimes are very often international crimes, like war crimes, crimes in maybe even genocide in terms of slavery, in terms of the Atlantic and the Yazidi community, for example. That is something what would be our desire. Of course, it will cause a lot of additional workload, but nevertheless, this is the mandate, and it is actually the unique chance. Which is provided by UNITA. This is something the international community should use.
So the added value of all of it is very much also giving an international crimes label to what happened and ensuring prosecution under the label rather than simply under the terrorist label.
Exactly. It makes it possible that in the end we have victims' participation in the trials. Yeah, so it is different from membership in a terrorist organization. You can prove that with some documents and that's it. Maybe compassion and the international crimes like slavery, like sexual slavery, like rape, like killing of persons protected under the international humanitarian law. That always requires the participation of the civil society, the participation of the victims, of the witnesses, and that leads to reconciliation in the country, in this case in Iraq, and that is actually what we want to achieve.
Thank you. Just one thought about these, I've really said that, taking after your book, taking the two chapter 7 tribunals, the ICTR and ICTY, as the starting point of modern international criminal law in terms of institutions. Especially where according to the chapter 7 resolutions, those tribunals have primacy over national jurisdiction or anything else, which I said. And moved on to the ICC without reverse what because complementarity is seen with this jurisdiction where they can't give their international case. That was the design. Then you move to the phase of hybrid and internationalizing national courts. And now the state where we are is exemplified by the IIIM and UNITA, where it's almost professionalizing the gathering of evidence. So that is what really said that is what international criminals can do, is gathering evidence rather than creating new courts, for which there will not be that much of this. The next best thing is to have these institutions that have top quality evidence to use within everybody else. So I think the standards that such as the people are putting on, that's a very, very important feature. But not people to that level of new courts, the next best thing. Remember something, any courts to set up, having courts needed. It's extremely, with a view to international rights, like you said, it's almost tailored because they kind of go to somebody else. So I think that's the cooperation that's valuable. That's what we're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we had a really fantastic contributions. We have a wonderful expert panel, so I now open up the floor for any interventions, questions, and probably we will collect questions in order to make it more interactive. Yes, please. Maybe you can briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for sharing with us these experience. My name is Taylor Woodcock, and I'm a PhD and my question brings us back to the issue of living forever. So under Article 7 of the Anonymous Convention, it does not go as far as to obligate states to criminalize convicted conduct as an international crime. It is limited to the enactment of penal legislation. But nevertheless, we did hear some impressive statistics about national implementation, and it is the case that in many instances, states have criminalized this conduct as international crimes, in particular war crimes. So in lieu of an authoritative articulation of customary international law, I'm curious to hear what your view is on how this impacts customary international law, whether a prohibition under customary international law is distinguishable from a customary international law crime, and whether these instances of national implementation could be used to support an argument on the basis of state practice, jurists, or whether we need to see actual prosecutions to take place. Thank you.
Many thanks. Let's maybe like a few more questions.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. Boyd. Good. Philip, I'm not from the ICT and the Station Operation section of the registry, and I had a question that goes a little bit into that area. This is really regarding both mechanisms. Imagine we didn't have national precedents. Imagine we didn't have the potential court that Michelle was referring to. Is there any thinking of creating at least some sort of a public database outreach that actually provides a historical record of what you're collecting, so that on the one hand, the work that you're doing doesn't become a database that is only accessible to those prosecuting authorities that want to bring a case, but also to the public, and obviously then for the victims, for this to become a vehicle that you could spin measures from that go into reconciliation, that go into reparations, and all sorts of programs in the areas. Thank you.
Okay, and let's be the third question on the right.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. This is not a question, it is intervention. I'm Attribution at I would like to take the report this senior and thank you, Richard, for his support and for his team. Great work in Iraq. I would like to say that 9 years back, on 14th of June, 2014, we wake up with a real crisis in Iraq, and I was working also as a DPR and FCW. With 41 or more thousand fighters coming from 110 countries to Iraq. And you can imagine the size of the crisis that we were in. And the funny thing that we have to justify what's going on with the obstacle. While some of the countries here were having more than 1,000 fighters in my country, fighting the land and slavery for the doing slavery for the Iraqi people. Anyway, after 9 years, I would like to say that the support of the international society was a great help. And I would like to say also that the other countries have to be aware of what happened in Iraq, because in one day we found all this huge number of fighters in our country without any introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana, for this intervention. There's one more question here in the middle. Oh, no, please. Eva, yeah. Eva.
A question to Fabian and a question to Christian. So, is it correct to say that while the Anonymous Convention itself and the terms as kind of the implementation of the criminal universal cases is limited, through the lens of pointing this gap, and almost absolutely universal, but you know, the Geneva Convention, the implementation of that, which did kind of a form of the weapon for a while. universality that might be restricted from a conventional perspective. It's not the same substance or similar substance, not kind of it's widely applied to national systems. And my question to you, Christian, is it's about the policy of fighting against impunity between domestic courts and international courts. So, in a way, for example, the German example, the idea that a lot of arrest warrants come out. There's often seems to be a policy in different countries that, you know, is there a likelihood of arrest? Is there a likelihood of the perpetrator coming to decide whether to get an arrest warrant? Well, for example, Germany actually went a bit further and was active with that. We see that a lot of police forces are actually restricted from a budget perspective, from a domestic perspective, of spending taxpayer money on where the likelihood might be very limited, but the strategic impact of having an arrest warrant is very high. Something that you don't see in international courts where there's this active fight against impunity rather than the reactive way that someone kind of arrives. So, what was your experience in being, a prosecutor on the kind of active front rather than kind of waiting for victims or perpetrators to be?
Thank you, and I'm going one last question.
So good afternoon. Natalia, Latin University alumni and space lawyer. My question is actually more specifically to Michelle, which is with the introduction of Earth observation, specifically Starlink, for example. Do you see a significant increase in the evidence that is being provided now that more remote areas and there's more access to people who have not been able to do this before, as you said, from say civilians? Do you see this change? Do you predict that this might have an impact on evidence collection in the future? Thank you.
So let's maybe a little bit more about Michelle to think about it. I think the first question was about our framework of international law, a bit more way to even do with legal practice and what could be confirmed on the lack of legal practice. So really, this is for you.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very, very pertinent question. At the bottom of this question, I think it's a very old, familiar question of method of identifying international law to its sources. What you're really saying is to what extent can general custom be inferred on the basis of treaty practice in implementing that treaty domestically? That was what we're saying. To what extent is implementing treaty practice evidence of being and so on? Well, again, it comes down to what I'm saying. I think we need that articulation. You about custom international laws. It's talk about a little bit is that most people have already said as we said, studying, say we think this stuff analysis excellence. But when it changes, you have to have an articulation that you mentioned. But I think that in this case, and this goes to Graham's question as well, I think that there is, like I mentioned before, a wealth of behaviors out there individually, even if you cannot rely specifically on treaty practice. So I think it's so complicated with practice out there. In the statement in international laws, for example, all kinds of states, well, individual level. It's I think that not able somebody to share that already discussed. Having had that much of legislation, you have to look at the words used, to what extent they say this is OEC or OEC, or they say this is a matter of international law. You have to look at the language of national institutions, how to rely on it as a result of more grounds to justification. But my view, which I spoke about it just before, I think there is not there was the conditions.
Thank you very much to support of a modern vision of Castellan international. Anyway, so let's get to the last question. I think you're ready to get into the comparison about digitalization. I think it's happening in both of your institutions and our future victims, but also use the record of the institution. You could imagine that these are the things like multiple cases of domestic jurisdiction. So how do you prepare for that, and so what extent is the power of that?
practice. Yeah, as I mentioned, actually, of course, this is a challenge. But in the end, as I mentioned, there's already a set of implementation on international crimes. That means, look at Germany, where we have these Nazi perpetrators. We are accountable now in 70 years after the Second World War. So this is something we can think about in terms of Nazi perpetrators as well. And most of them were, I don't know, quite young when they committed these horrible crimes. And so there is a chance that we're going to see crimes on charges of international, we're going to see trials on charges of international crimes against Nazi perpetrators even in 40 years or something like this. So that means that will not exist at that time anymore. So we're going to have in the end an archive, digital archive, whatever, which is legally acceptable, which has to be, I think, has to be developed from time, and then it has to be reestablished from time to time in terms of modern technology. And in the end, this is the legacy, and the legacy of UNITA is something what can be used for jurisdictions wherever they are in the world. And maybe, well, it is up to the United Nations to decide on if it is acceptable for historians, for people who are interested in the history of Iceland as well, and to see what happened at that time when Iceland committed these heinous crimes. That is, of course, something you can think about. It's true.
Do you want to go on any of the other questions as well?
Well, the other one was active one. Well, this was a little bit more about my experience as a federal prosecutor. I think, well, from my point of view, but this is in speaking on my own behalf, not as a federal prosecutor, but as a unit I represent. But I think it's always a good idea to be a bit more active on the active side in terms of holding perpetrators of international crimes accountable. Because in the end, the whole system of international criminal law only works if you're connecting with other like-minded prosecution services, international entities, whoever together, whoever's working on NGOs, civil society actors, and in the end, you can achieve results like issuing arrest warrants, because an arrest warrant makes this thing narrow perpetrators. Now they can very often not leave their own countries anymore, things like that. And I think that is, well, this is my very personal experience that being creative in terms of international criminal law, being creative in terms of holding perpetrators accountable is always a good idea, not just waiting for them to arrive and then you're going to start working. But this is something you can do as well. It's probably even legal, and it's probably even in accordance with applicable law, procedural law. But my personal approach is more to be more proactive, to be thinking about measures to help perpetrators and others close safe havens, and to be more on the active side, actually.
Thank you. Yourself?
Thanks. Maybe I'll just start with a very quick addition on the customary international law question. Just to say that I think, as you alluded to, Carsten, actually there are different approaches to assessing customary international law. And I think about it a lot in the context of the ad hoc courts and tribunals, where I think there was a very flexible approach taken to customary international law assessment and quite a wide view of what constitutes state practice and opinio juris. Certainly, though, we do have to be making that distinction between what is a prohibition and what is a criminal offence. So the analysis has to be done for that. But yeah, I think even the fact that the AAAM's mandate, it's the resolution and terms of reference, talk about chemical weapons being a focus of the AAAM's work in the context of a criminal mandate is helpful when it comes to assessing customary international law. On the database question, Philip, a really interesting question, and something I've thought about a lot, actually, again, as a result of my experience at the ICTY over many years, and having seen the Office of the Prosecutor there build an evidence collection over 20 years, starting with the purpose of it feeding the ICTY criminal trials. But by the end of its work, it was obvious that it had become such a valuable archive of the conflicts in the Balkans more generally, with multiple purposes being potentially open for that material. I think there is a process in going through converting something that's been collected for a specific narrow criminal law framework into some of these broader historical, even there were requests to use it for immigration purposes, missing persons. Certainly compensation could have been an issue if there was an avenue for that. So we've started with that in mind at the IIIM, the idea that we are building this, I think, unprecedented central repository, drawing from so many different sources, and it will become an incredibly valuable resource for not just criminal accountability, but for broader justice objective and historical and hopefully reconciliation purposes. It's hard to know when you're at the core base with the criminal focus what to do to best facilitate that, because a lot of it is unknown. But one thing that we have done, drawing very much on the ICTY experience, is recognise that because of the vast number of missing persons in Syria, we've got even conservative estimates, 100,000 people unaccounted for still as a result of detention and forced disappearance and other things in Syria. And we know that in the course of the material that we're collecting, the work that we do, we are going to have leads that might help shed light on the whereabouts and fate of some of those people. So organising our work in a way that we could potentially channel those insights to those who are mandated to search for the missing would already be a really valuable thing. So even tagging that material and identifying it, the categories that might be relevant for someone with a focus on this person. It's just one example, but I think it is the kind of thing you could also have in mind for future compensation processes, or even vetting at the point where that would be a procedure that was being undertaken. So I think it's a really important thing for accountability actors to be mindful of the broader landscape within which their work sits, and the fact that for victims and survivors, criminal accountability is important, but it's one aspect of a much broader package of legitimate demands and reparation interests. But just to give you an idea of the size of our central repository, we have 3.75 million records preserved. So our record could be a whole database, that's huge. 246 terabytes of material, and that's just what we've collected so far. It is going to grow, and we know that the issue in Syria is not lack of evidence. The challenge is the overwhelming amount of material available, because it is the first conflict, when we now see Ukraine and others, where the digital aspect of the documentation of the crimes, everything being recorded on smartphones, everything being posted on social media, just presents huge challenges for documenters. And I think this gets to your question. I'm slightly terrified to be asked a question by Faithful. I'm not sure that I fully understood which particular area you were focusing on, but I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards, because I may not have properly understood. But what I can say is the IIIM's mandate, when it was set up, was definitely having in mind this new paradigm for documentation based on the volume of digital evidence, and the fact that we would have to be using new technologies to try to facilitate our documentation work. So we've done a lot of work on trying to build that kind of framework. We are, of course, working with technologies, not so new, but maybe new in accountability processes, relatively, like satellite imagery and other things. But I think our overall assessment is that technology can, of course, be a useful amplifier of your work, but fundamentally you still need a lot of those traditional documentation methods, and there will be no substitute for having victim survivor accounts. There will be no substitute for expert witnesses or overview witnesses who can really help us pull this material together. And the technology can help us improve our searchability of the repository. And how do you find a piece of relevant information in a body of almost 4 million records consisting of hard drives and databases of phone, SIM cards and all of that sort of thing. And so we need technology, but it still just requires really time-consuming, meticulous analysis to be able to put these tests together.
So I think we will have a blended mortality in our panel for B. We're really benefited, I think, from some of the people who are really at the forefront of dealing with the new evidentiary challenges and how to move from investigations to prosecutions. I think what I'm really saying from this is that we have to think about a multifaceted framework which goes like beyond only criminalizing everything. We have state responsibility, we have civil responsibility, we have documentation, we have new files, we have new investigations. So I think the accountability framework has some broadening, has some directed steps. And that I think is, I think, a comforting, a very comforting message. Of course, it will take time. I think that's what I think all of our panelists were sharing. We are at the beginning of something quite new, given how few prosecutions we've had in the past. We have to think about how to refine also some of the coordination between different institutions that have been created, how to build new partnerships to encourage and empower also domestic jurisdictions. So there's a lot of, I think, work ahead, but it seems that a lot of the legal groundwork is done by some of these institutions that will allow us to move forward. So I think I'm particularly thankful, of course, to Ambassador Thomas Fried and to the Embassy of Germany for initiating this event. And again, Costa Rica, Cyprus, Japan, Mexico, Poland, the International Partnership Against Impunity, and of course the Netherlands, who really helped us support this event and think this through. Obviously, we miserably failed in answering all of the questions that are arising, but now we have some time to gather for a drinks reception to continue some of the discussions. So please join me in giving a big round of applause to our panelists. And this concludes our panel.